Hello, everyone. This is Jason White, and welcome to our sixth ISO podcast. I'm joined on this podcast by Jonatan Åcerclinth. Jonatan, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Really looking forward to this opportunity.
Oh, yeah, me too. We have a very, very special guest today. As you all know, at ISO, we're all about creating fun and challenging sim races for our members, but we're also very passionate about motor racing history. And today's guest should be able to provide us with many historical insights. He's a former Formula One, Indycar, and sports car driver. He's an accomplished artist and designer, and he currently manages the careers of several drivers. Please welcome to the podcast, Stefan Johansson. Stefan, thanks so much for making the time for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, so how's 2020 been for you? I mean, it's been a crazy year, obviously, but I'm sure it's given you an opportunity to work on what you enjoy best, your artwork.
Yeah, well, there's been, a positive in that regard. Yeah, because the travel's obviously been minimal, which has kind of left me here in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, where I have my studio. So I've been pretty productive doing that, and then managing the business for the drivers and all the other racing activities I do more or less over the phone or via Zoom, like now. That seems to be the new the new way of communicating.
Yeah, well, we're glad that you're prospering, doing well, and staying healthy in this crazy time. I'm going to hand it over to Jonatan to start because he's a countryman of yours, and he has a lot of very specific questions about your background to ask you. So, Jonatan, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Jason. So, Stefan, to begin with, I was listening to an interview that you did with Marshall Pruitt, and you mentioned, well, to get us into the question, obviously you're one of the top three most successful F1 drivers Sweden has seen, but on that interview, you said that you also played soccer and especially ice hockey on a more or less semi-professional level, and alongside doing karting. And I'm wondering what made racing the move that you felt was the right one for you, considering the sport you did otherwise.
I think that it comes back to the passion. I think, what you want. And I think the racing was what I was most passionate about. No doubt. Yeah. And I think although, I played ice hockey in what was called the second division back then in Sweden, before we had the elite series as we do now.
Indeed.
But, so that it kind of had a natural progression. And when I was 18, I decided to try to make the move, make a career out of it, and moved over to England. So that kind of killed any ambitions of going any further with the ice hockey, because England is not exactly famous for its hockey players. So I killed that project. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Did you also feel straight away that was the correct choice, or did you ever wonder about that?
Well, I mean, when I started with karting, I started driving when I was 8, and I started racing. You couldn't start racing until you were 12 back then. But it was already then, I mean, immediate, the dream from that age on really was to become a Formula One driver. That was kind of like any boy, I think, when they start racing, and that's just all that consumes your mind, more or less, so that was,
Indeed,
that was definitely the boyhood dream from very early age. Yeah.
Okay. To also go into more that karting, from what I've understood, during your karting days, one of those that you looked to measure yourself against was Ronnie Peterson. Was he also your role model from the very moment you started karting or maybe when you started racing, or did you have several over the years?
Well, I mean, you always have, like, when you're young like that, you obviously have your heroes or whatever, but I don't think, not really as a role model as such. I don't think. It was more like Ronnie was the big star in Sweden at the time, obviously. He just made it into Formula One as I sort of progressed into, I think I was still doing karting, in fact, when he started in F1. Yeah. So though he was obviously the big hero for everyone in Sweden, because and he was, extremely good, obviously. So, of course, But as far as like a role model, I don't think I had any role models as such. I was just trying to form my own kind of identity along the way, something that works for you. I think if you pigeonhole yourself into try to be someone else, then it's difficult,
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. But Ronnie was no doubt a hero, but I think my first ever hero was probably Jim Clark when I was
really?
like 5 or 6 years old. Yeah, before I even started driving, because obviously my dad was racing before, so I used to go with him to all the races when I was 3 years old. And I remember seeing Jim Clark. Actually, it's funny because back then they did the I think it was called Formula Junior or something back then at Roskilde Ring in Denmark. And they were all racing there, Jack Brabham, Jim Clark, Frank Williams, all those guys. So I remember it was like, oh, this is like incredible for me as a little kid,
Yeah, must have
I
been.
remember getting the autographs from all of them. It was amazing.
I can see. I can see why the passion maybe was born there when you saw all those
Yeah.
great guys as well, and met them and found out how they were as both people and
I
drivers.
think not only that, but I mean, racing, as in comparison to other, I don't know what it is, but it definitely is. It has an intensity that I think very few sports have, but you can't necessarily appreciate it or see it until you're right. You got to be in the middle of it, in the thick of it, because there's so many layers to racing, that you don't even see or appreciate when you just watch it on television, for example. Both from the technical side and human side and everything else. So you get sucked into it pretty quickly if you're in that environment all the time. You become unbelievably passionate about it. So it was probably there from from very, very early age. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
And I realize you partly answered this question really, but I'm still interested to know, since I'm a big touring car enthusiast. Did you ever, on your way up the racing ladder, think about considering changing direction and going towards touring cars, for example, like Rickard Rydell did in about 10 odd years later? Or did anyone ever pull on you in that area?
Think, I mean, I only had one goal, and that was to be a Formula One driver. I mean, I literally ate, slept, and breathed being a Formula One driver. That's all that was occupying my mind, all the way. And I had hundreds of setbacks, and this and that, but it never wavered. That was all I wanted to be. So I never even considered, I had plenty of offers to go do touring cars and this and that, but full championships, which then would mean that, if I do that, then that's change of direction, and then you kind of kill any dreams you have of becoming a Formula One driver. So it was 100% focus on getting to Formula One, and that's all I ever dreamt about. And I think what happens to a lot of these guys, like Rickard, for example, who's obviously unbelievably talented driver and could have easily made it to Formula One just as well as any one of his competitors at that time who made it to F1. He was equally good to any of those, I would say. And Kenny, the same thing. Kenny Brack, for example,
yes, of course.
He chose going straight to IndyCar instead of pursuing his Formula One dream. But I can assure you that there is not one of these guys that dream about being a touring car driver when they're in that stage of their career. That just kind of happens by default because that's the only option you might have, and you want to carry on driving, obviously. But I don't think anyone will say, I think I fancy touring cars much more than F1. I mean, that just, I don't think.
Very few and far between, maybe.
Yeah,
if any.
Absolutely. Yeah. So.
I don't know, maybe just to finish off there, you talked about going to Britain and racing a little bit in Formula 3. I read, I can't remember where I read it, but they were talking about a wet race you did at, I believe, Silverstone in those Formula 3s, where you really proved your worth as it were as a very good driver in the wet there. Do you remember that race
Yeah,
at
I
all?
think it was the first race I won, in fact, in F3, yeah, in British Formula 3. Yeah, that was in '79, I believe. Yeah, with the Chevron, which was a real dog of a car, But in the rain, you could sort of make it work, So, but that kind of got me to drive with Ron Dennis the following year in
Okay.
1980 with Project 4. This was before he had McLaren, of course. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that was the start. I mean, I made the choice of going British F3 rather than the European Championship because back then it seemed like that was the proving ground to make the step into Formula One maybe easier than the European Championship. And it was, I mean, unbelievably competitive back then. I mean, F3 was really, I mean, well, not so much now, of course, but I mean, it was brutally competitive, which is what you want as a driver, of course.
Yeah. Was it really a situation where it was down to the skills of the driver more than anything? I mean, I would think the power plants were pretty even across the board at that point.
Well, power plants are all the same. I mean, everybody was using the Toyota back then, I think, the Nova motor. I mean, it just ended up being that way. It was open to any manufacturer, but they were so dominant that that's what everybody had who wanted to win, at least at that particular time. Volkswagen came in a year or two later on and had a very good engine too. But at that point, it was all the Toyota that mattered. So, but I mean, it's always a combination between driver, team, engineer, and especially when you have these sort of one make formulas, which it's sort of kind of were back then. The interaction between the driver and the engineer is really, really important. You got to have that kind of rapport between the two, to squeeze that loss, because you literally looking at, fraction of 1% that makes a difference in the end, and if you add it all up at the end of the day, if you come up with 10 of those and they all work out, then you have an advantage. And that's kind of where, that's just the dynamic you work with the whole time in all those categories.
Yeah. Speaking of the technical side of things, that's a great segue into the next set of questions. I mean, one of the neat things about your career is that the timing of it gave you experience in a variety of different open wheel formulae and a lot of different power plant situations. For example, the turbocharged F1 cars from like 83 to 87, let's say, then the normally aspirated ones that followed. And then you ended up back driving turbocharged cars in IndyCar racing. I'm curious what that transition back and forth was like for you, and why do you think certain drivers make that transition better than others?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. I mean, every driver have their own driving style, their own technique, and certain cars definitely suit certain drivers better than others, and sometimes you find that magic formula, when the car is just perfect for your style of driving,
Certainly.
You can see it. I think Vettel is a good example now. He was just brilliant with the car that Red Bull had, with the blown diffuser and all that stuff. He could maximize that setup to the umpteenth degree, but I don't think he's ever been comfortable with a car with these weird long wheelbase cars that we have now in F1, which requires obviously quite a different style of driving. So I think it's always, certain drivers, they blossom in a certain time period because the cars do suit their style of driving. And then there are others who have the ability to adapt and make the car kind of, or adapt their driving style to make it work either way. I mean, I think even Michael, when he was a Ferrari, and they were using the Bridgestones, and he was kind of doing all the testing, I mean, the car was just perfect built for him, I mean, it was like a go-kart, there wasn't any of his teammates just couldn't drive the car because it was so pointy and so fast turning, because that's how he liked it. And the tires, everything was developed around that, so he was blindingly quick in that car, of course, but everybody else was really fighting it, to just kind of, because it was a very, very nervous car, but if you can handle that, it's absolutely the quickest car.
Yeah. It reminds me of another distinction between your F1 time and your time in Indy cars. In F1, the car is designed specifically by the team, and it's a bespoke entity in a lot of ways, in almost every way. And And then in IndyCar racing, even though you had a Penske, which there weren't many of on the grid, it's a car that was, a customer car. It was designed so that it would be able to fit a variety of drivers. Going from a team where everything was designed around the two people that were driving the cars, going to a customer car or a spec series, what was that like?
Well, I mean, it's much better, I think, in a way, because I mean, with F1, okay, every car is designed around a driver, but I think the engineers, if they could, they're designed it around like a midget, so they can package the thing absolutely, minimize everything to get the best air out of it, because sometimes you get in a car and it's like you can't even move. I mean, literally, you couldn't move your elbows. It was like, I mean, you're like a cripple when you. After 10 laps in some of these cars, and then, well, we got 2% more, downforce out of it, or 2% less drag. And it's like, well, what good is that if I can't drive the damn car after 10 laps, I mean, literally, many times I've had that experience in F1,
Yeah, I remember, I think, Jackie Stewart testing a March and pointing out that there was no dead pedal in the car.
Yeah.
And that he didn't think that he could get the maximum out of that car simply because it was so uncomfortable to drive. And he remembered that Capelli had complained of leg cramps that year. So there you go.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, this was very common. I mean, you were wearing elbow pads, knee pads, and you walk like Quasimodo when you get out of the car for like a week,
Cool. Another thing technically that you had to adapt to when you came to America to race Indy cars was oval racing. And I'm really curious about your reaction to that, because it is kind of a mixed bag. I mean, there are people who took to it really well, like Emerson Fittipaldi, and then there were other drivers who did it simply because it was like kind of, well, if you're going, IndyCar racing, this is something you got to do. It wasn't like by choice. But I'm curious, like, what your reaction to it was. I mean, you're driving at Monaco between walls, and it's very tight and everything. But what was your reaction when you started oval racing?
Well, I took to it quite well. I think the first year, I mean, oval racing is tricky, but in my opinion, in many ways, it's the purest form of racing. Because there's always action. I used to love like the mile ovals were so much fun to race, because it's like there's not 1 second in the race where it's quiet. You either chasing someone or there's someone chasing you. You got lap traffic. It's just action the whole time, and a lot of strategy and a lot of you got to adapt all the time, to the conditions and stuff. And of course, Indy then is a whole, let's just take it to a whole different level. I mean, I think Indy is Indy for a reason. I mean, it is a mighty experience to do that race. Both from setting the car up for qualifying, do the qualifying runs, to the race and everything that goes on. It's about as good as it gets.
Did you find it hard to shut out all the hoopla and all the pomp and circumstance that's part of the Indy experience? Because that's some drivers are really good at shutting all that stuff out. Others get kind of taken by it. How did you take that?
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of did. I mean, even in Formula One, I was never sort of got caught up in all the BS, if you like. I mean, I kind of just try to stay focused on my thing, and you do what you have to do, obviously for sponsors and promoters and all the rest of it. But otherwise, I just kind of knuckle down and just try to stay focused and keep the eye on the prize, and just try to get the job done. Yeah.
And then you also had forays into endurance racing in the 80s. What was it like, driving a group? What was it like driving a Group C car in parallel to F1 in its heyday? Was it similar in terms of the fuel saving aspect and the downforce between the two series?
Well, actually, the Group C cars back then were just monsters, because they had the full tunnel from the front base. So the downforce on those cars were just insane. Plus, they had, in qualifying, we had 1,000 horsepower, 1,100 horsepower at Le Mans, for example. So, I mean, they were mighty cars to drive. I mean, I think the 80s in general maybe was the best era we've ever had in racing, because there was like no, whatever you could dream up, just put it on the track and run it. It was like crazy, these cars. Massive horsepower, huge downforce, and of course now when you look back at it, I mean, unbelievably unsafe. But we thought they were really safe back then, because the only reference point we had was the 70s, when the cars used to go up in flames every weekend somewhere, and with the tubular frames and everything, so, but everything is relative, but I do think that the 80s were probably in many ways the best era, because those cars were just mental to drive, I mean, F1, we had over 1,500 horsepower in qualifying. I mean, the qualifying lap around Monaco was just a blur, I mean, you just literally try to keep the car pointing straight for the most time. And it was crazy, but it was fun. I mean, for a driver, it's like the ultimate experience,
And of course, then there was the difference between how you set the car for qualifying with, as you say, 1,500 horsepower, and then for an actual Grand Prix, which is a very different kettle of fish.
Well, not only that, but also the fuel, it had massive amount of fuel in the car back then as well. So the difference between, and we had the qualifying tires, of course, one lap qualifiers. So, I mean, the difference in qualifying and race pace was massive, so, but that was all part of it, I mean, that's every category and every formula has its own quirks and things. You got to become a specialist on whatever car you drive, that's just the name of the game, basically.
Yeah, and another specialty that you got to experience was like the 12 hours of Sebring and 24 hours of Le Mans, which are premier endurance races.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of success there in 97. Yeah. So comparing those two, I mean, those are two races that, I mean, obviously they're both endurance races, and it involves, taking care of a car over a long period of time. But what was the difference like between like those two races as far as teammates and circuits? And I'm assuming it would take a different driving style for sure between those two.
Between Le Mans and Sebring, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and yeah, it is, because they're different tracks, but then every track is different, so I mean, you just adapt to whatever, the car and the track gives you at that particular point in time, but Sebring is unique because it's so bumpy, which makes it very challenging, and it's an incredibly fun race. I mean, I love that race, and it's physically maybe even more demanding than Le Mans, because you spend most of the time at Le Mans on the straights. But Le Mans, again, I mean, that's the ultimate, of course, in sports car racing. It's a grind. I mean, it's 24 hours, and it's just because it's so fast, and if you do something wrong, it's going to punish you. So I mean, it's and with the traffic, the slower cars, and that kind of crown on the road and stuff, there's a lot of issues, a lot of things you got to deal with there, and then of course you got the Porsche curves, which at least before they started widening the runoff was absolutely the most challenging section of corners on any track in the world, I think, at the time. It was just mighty. I mean, when you got it right, it was like worth the whole 24 hours just for that one time you managed to get it right in the whole race, which is very difficult, because I think I've done, I think 18 races at Le Mans, and I think I probably had, during the race, maybe 5 laps without traffic. Literally, and of course you think because you got the delta on the dashboard, so you can see what your lap time is compared to the best lap time you've done, or the best lap time the car's done during the race. So you always kind of you're working on that. Oh, you got section 1 right, got tetra, boom, gained another 10th, first chicane, second chicane, and you keep building it up. So you're like 7/10 down, compared to the best time. And then you get into the Porsche curves, and there's like some old Porsche or a, GT car parked in the middle of the track, oh, you got to start again. It's like every lap is like that. So, it's frustrating, but it's an amazing race. Yeah.
It's funny, Stefan, you started out by telling us, that when you were younger, you were very focused, laser focused on Formula One, and that was the pinnacle. and then and you achieved that, obviously. But the irony is that you ended up becoming a very versatile driver with a whole plethora of experiences. I mean, just the duality of that, like starting with that focus and then becoming such a versatile driver. I mean, do you look back on that and think that, you know, are you surprised by the way that path turned out, or?
Well, I mean, you know, it's not surprised. I mean, I think it all happens for a reason in many ways, you know. I mean, I decided at the end of my F1 career that to make the switch to America, to IndyCar. I've been looking at it for in fact, I actually had an offer from Carl Haas in '86.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, already to come over to do IndyCar when I was, you know, when I was starting my second year with Ferrari.
Shoot.
For a massive amount of money at the time. And of course, you know, now I want to be world champion, so I turned it down then. But I did go over there and met with them, you know, and I went to a couple of races. And funny enough, the technical director for Haas back then was Adrian Newey, of course.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
Which is interesting. But yeah, so then it took, you know, another sort of 5 years, I guess, 5 or 6 years before I then decided to come back, you know, then done my thing in F1 and, you know, I decided to have a go, you know, and I fell in love with it immediately.
Yeah, and you got to experience your first experiences in IndyCar were with a team, as we talked about earlier, that was a very small, close-knit team. I mean, that must have been a lot of fun coming from Formula One, where it's a massive team and suddenly it's a small team.
Yeah, it was refreshing because, you know, having spent almost 10 years in F1 at that point, you know, and you have to deal with all it's a massive amount of pressure the whole time, but it's also a massive amount of BS you have to deal with the whole time, with the press and the media and the politics and this, that, and the other. You know, it's not necessarily a friendliest environment, if you like. So to come over there and have a little family team, you know, with a couple of guys. I mean, in F1, you're used to, you know, physiotherapists and dietitians and yada yada. I remember I did the first test with Tony at Button Willow, and they just rolled out there with a little pickup truck. I did like 10-lap shakedown just to make sure the seat fit and everything before we went to Detroit. And, you know, so what was this? Anyway, the team manager guy said, so after I'd done my run, you know, I said, do we have any drinks, any water? Said, no, we got some Mountain Dew.
Oh, that's awesome.
You know, it's like, water? What's that like?
Oh my goodness. Well, one of the
completely different world, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you're still engaged in the world of racing through your management.
Yeah, very
drivers
much
like
so.
Scott
I mean,
Dixon.
I'm as engaged now as I was when I was driving, really, because, you know, I got Scott and Felix and a couple of other guys, and then I work a lot with Scuderia Corsa on the GT program with them, and, you know, involved with various teams, a little bit involved in Formula One still on various levels. So yeah, I'm heavily engaged still, definitely. Yeah.
Well, with that level of engagement still, I'm sure you have some opinions on what's going on right now. I mean, Roger Penske taking over the series, and there's a lot of hope among American, you know, open wheel racing fans that this is going to lead to a new renaissance for the series. Like if you had Roger's ear and you had any suggestions for him on how to improve the series for the drivers and the fans, what would you tell him?
Well, I think IndyCar, in my opinion, is absolutely the best racing series in the world as far as the competition goes. There's nothing that comes close to IndyCar. I mean, every race is a nail biter pretty much, and it's always exciting. There's all these different layers of, you know, the strategy, the this, that, the yellows. There's just so many factors that play into the end result. I mean, you can be dominant the whole weekend and you get a yellow with 5 laps to go and everything changes, you know. Kind of like last weekend in F1 in a way, you know. So as far as the racing go, the competition side, I think they've done an unbelievably good job at controlling the cost. I mean, the competition is brutal now. I mean, it's so close between literally the top to to the bottom.
Mm.
I mean, anyone can pretty much win on a given day. You know, if you roll the dice and you get the strategy right, literally anyone can win.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think from that point of view, it's as good as it can get, pretty much. I think the marketing is what needs to, you know, improve. I mean, it's kind of the best kept secret in the world in a way, you know, in motor racing at least. I mean, it should be. Can you? I mean, imagine if F1 had one race like IndyCar does, with so much happening. You know, I mean, it would be. I mean, people would go ballistic. You know, so I think it's just if we can figure the marketing out and really bring it much more to the or get the masses more engaged and enjoy it, I think then it could really be huge again, you know, which it deserves to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's very insightful. Um, we would be very remiss if we didn't talk about your art and design work, because as you mentioned in 2020, you've had a lot of time to work on it, and you know, it's clearly something you're very passionate about. Uh, we've looked at your paintings and especially the large form ones, which are really cool. Uh, a lot of artists, you know, are kind of inclined to have a sensibility of several forms of art. Is all of your work just painting, or have you ventured into things like music, literature, sculpture, poetry, even if you haven't released things like that? Do you have a
I've been
variety of?
dabbling a little bit with different things. I mean, I've got some sculpture things that I'd like to develop eventually. It's just a matter of finding the right sort of really the right place to create it, you know, because it's quite large scale and it'll be quite complicated to do. But I mean, right now, you know, I'm focused on my two different styles of painting, really, which is the abstracts, which is what I call memories from a past life, which is sort of inspired by different parts of racetracks around the world. So I name each painting after a corner or a section of a track or this, that, and the other, something that ignites a memory of some sort. And then I got the portraits, which is completely the other direction, which is very detailed, very, you know, figurative, very, you know, really sort of hyper realism in a way, you know, but with these quotes laid on top to kind of, you know, blur the vision of the subject with the text that kind of bring a meaning. Well, to me, at least, they're meaningful in some way. And what I'm trying to achieve is, I guess, to get a reaction from the viewer somehow, you know, whether it's make them laugh, angry, happy, thoughtful, whatever it may be. But so these are different quotes from the people that are the subjects of the paintings, basically. So I did, for example, I did this one of Enzo Ferrari, which is where it's a quote from him from, I think, the 50s sometimes, where he talks about violence and how violence demands your attention, whether you like it or not. And it's like the prime force of, you know, of society. And this is in the 50s, and it couldn't be more true today. I mean, it's like the most prophetic statement you could ever see in what's happening in the world today.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm, you know, just different things like that to hopefully get a reaction from the viewer somehow.
Are there particular
through all that, but with the abstract art, what we're doing now is to trying to commercialize. I didn't really think of that when I started making the paintings, but they actually lend themselves really well to various products. You know, like we're doing the face mask now, the hats. We're doing some tote bags. We're going to do T-shirts, jackets, and a whole range of merchandise, basically based around that art. And so far, it's been really well received. You know, we're selling quite well. We're just selling through Instagram and our website, so not a huge push, but we're doing really well. Actually, I'm quite surprised how popular it's got. So
yeah, I'm very happy with the masks myself.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're great. No, it's fantastic that you've been able to parlay that into that section of it. That's how we connected with you initially, was through Instagram.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
You have such
cool.
a good presence on there.
Yeah. I got a guy. I sadly must admit, I barely know my password to get on there, but I got this Swedish guy, Ronnie, who's doing my Instagram, and he's doing a terrific job. So you know, it's good. Yeah.
Are there any? I know this is a difficult question, but are there any? What among your artistic creations are you the most proud of? I know it's always like, what am I going to do next? But you know.
Well, that's difficult.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's anyone in particular, but it's, I've been dabbling with paint for a long time. I did it as a hobby for years and years and years. And I never really wanted to show, really. It was just for my own kind of therapeutic reasons more than anything else. It was a way for me to relax, between races and stuff. So, and I think it's the same for any artist, probably. You're struggling to find that style that's your style, that's unique for you, But I think when I was eventually clicked in my head with these portraits and then the text and the quotes and everything, that's kind of unique for me. I think, I was hoping to find something that at least I could say, this is my style and I'm not copying anyone else. So I guess that's more than anything is probably what I'm proud of, to carry on that style. And it's because it is kind of my trademark, I guess, in that way.
Yeah.
So similar to how you went about your racing, that you want to find your style, your way of doing it, the same way with your art.
I think so. I think that's really important in whatever you do. You got to find that, because at least, if nothing else, you're comfortable with what you developed in the end. Yeah.
Probably
with art in particular, it's so tricky. I mean, art is obviously completely subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder, and it can be anything. And sometimes you see something and it's like complete and utter crap, but then but you might think it's fantastic. So I mean, it's really just up to the viewer. But I find, if I see one more work of art with a skull on it, or another copy of Marilyn Monroe, or but they're selling. So what can I say? I mean, I'm clearly doing something wrong in that regard if that's the case. So. But you got to be comfortable with what you're doing in life, no matter what. I think that's kind of part of what life is all about, I think. Yeah.
And you've got to do something that's true to you. Like you mentioned, finding your own voice as an artist. You have to be authentic about your own experiences. I mean, do you ever wonder what your art would have been like if you hadn't been a racer? How different it would have turned out?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I don't, maybe, who knows if I'd even had done it. I just, it's just the way life, the paths life takes you on, I mean, the art started for me really when, Elio De Angelis got killed. Because we were really good friends. I mean, we're like brothers almost. We were hanging out all the time together, and it was really a pretty tough time for me to get over that. And I still don't know to this day, but for whatever reason, I ended up going to an art store and buy some canvases and some paint and wanted to do something in his memory or whatever. And that's kind of what got me started, so I hadn't really touched a paintbrush until that point, so yeah.
Well, you mentioned the
maybe
therapeutic.
I never would have, if that hadn't happened. So
yeah, true.
Yeah. So
Well,
you just never know.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the therapeutic angle that art can take, and that probably had,
Well, very much so. I mean, like, I think now when I've stopped driving myself, that's it's tough for any high-level athletes, I think, to find the next step in your life, let's say, because any sport you do at the top level is like all consuming, and it's 90% is in your head, of your performance. So you're so focused on what you're doing. And if you let all that go, what do you do next? There's this massive void you need to fill with that's just been occupying your life since you were a little kid in most cases, with all these athletes. So what do you find? So I feel blessed in a way that I have the art, because the art, although it takes me a lot longer to get dialed in, get the flow going than it does because I was been racing my whole life. So 3 laps and I'm in that state of mind you need to be to get the job done in a race car. But with the art, it's a grind sometimes. It takes a while to get the flow going. But when it does, it's the same feeling. It's magic. It's just kind of you lose all sense of space, time. It's just you're just so immersed in what you do. And it's a wonderful thing, really.
Yeah. Well, Stefan, this has been fantastic. We can't thank you enough for your time, and also, quite frankly, for your candor. It's refreshing, your honesty, and
Thank you.
you know, I mean, that's something. I mean, obviously, in the racing world, it's at a premium, but in life in general, it's so nice to run into somebody who just, as a baseline, is just so honest and easy
Thank
to
you.
talk to.
I appreciate that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Jonathan, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to ask Stefan about while we have him, or?
Well, there were one thing I thought of. I read an interview about his name evades me now. Let's see. About Stefan Johansson and the Växjö Group, and an interview that was done with him. And
Okay.
one of the sort of memories he had of your career was the race you did with Tolman at not Imola, Monza in '84.
Yeah.
And a post-race bit with that. Is that something you remember as well as an interesting moment in your career?
The post race in what way, you mean?
He talks about a gentleman that looked a little small, a little unassuming, so to speak, but he came up and said, well, Enzo Ferrari would like to speak with Mr. Johansson, please.
Oh.
Is that anything you remember?
I think that was, well, I think that was, so, well, the whole story with Ferrari actually started, it's quite funny actually. So the first race I did with Spirit Honda, at Brands Hatch, the Race of Champions, which was not a championship race at that time. This was in '83. So we turned up with the first race we ever did with Honda, you know, because I got chosen to be the driver from the F2 program the year before. So we're at Silverstone, you know, and it's the first race for everybody, and it's freezing cold. And this car, you know, it was basically the F2 car that turned into an F1 car. I mean, you know, it was like, I mean, so crude, it was unbelievable. But it was also about at least 60, 70 kilos overweight, probably.
Oof.
Which actually worked in our favor because we were the only car getting the heat in the tires. So I looked like a god out there, you know, because I got some heat in the tires that no one else did. So I was like P1, P2 in every session, you know, in the free practice. So Dario Calzavari, who was the team manager for Ferrari at the time, was like, he was down there sniffing around, you know, it's like, oh, we would like to have a meeting with you later. Sure.
You know, that's funny.
So this relationship sort of carried on. So we kept in touch, you know, through the whole '83 season, and then '84, and then but what really clinched it was the race at Portugal in '84 with Tolman, also, where, you know, I outqualified Ayrton the first day, which of course in his mind was inconceivable, you know, that anyone could be faster than him. So I only found this out like 3 or 4 years later on, but apparently he forced the team to switch the engine. So he took my engine overnight for the Saturday qualifying, and you know, because something had to be, you know, the reason for anyway, long story short. But then I had that long battle with Niki Lauda, who was, you know, he had to finish 4th or better to win the championship, and we were fighting for 4th like most of the race. And then I got a slow puncture, so I had to come in to pits. But Enzo Ferrari was watching the race on TV, and of course, you know, then I got the call like the week later. You know, we should, you know, keep in touch and so on. But I already had a contract signed with Tolman at the time, so I couldn't really do anything then, you know. But we sort of just agreed to stay in touch, you know. And but then what happened in the following year in '85 was that Tolman didn't get any tires. I had to deal with Pirelli, and there was some political issue, so we couldn't do the first race in Rio. So I did a stand-in again for Ken Tyrrell, but the week after I got the call, because then they'd fired Arnoux. And I don't know what the reason was why they fired him to this day, but I got the call literally on, I think this was on a Monday, from Marco Piccinini, who was the team manager then. to go and meet him at the Savoy in London, because I lived in London at the time.
Okay.
And so we, agreed, and then okay. So then I flew down the next day. I had to call Alex Hawkridge first at Tolman. Said, look, I got an offer from Ferrari. And he said, well, I'm not going to hold you back. If you got an offer from Ferrari, I can't stop you, So he was very kind and released me from that contract. So then I flew down. I was there Tuesday night, I think it was. Met the old man, in his office in Modena. In fact, to be secret, where there was nothing going on, no activity there for years, But and then I did maybe 5-lap shakedown at Fiorano, and then we flew out to Portugal, and then that was it. It all happened in about a matter of 4 or 5 days.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's weird how life works. It's either feast or famine. It's always the way. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So that was it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
From me at least, for taking your time and talking to us. It's
of course,
been a pleasure.
My pleasure, definitely. Likewise.
We're really grateful to learn more about you and to hear these insights, and we're really glad that you're doing well and prospering in California, and we wish you continued success in the future.
Thank you. To you guys also. I hope everything goes well with your series and everything, and Cool. My son has started taking up sim racing now.
Oh, really?
Really?
Yeah. I got him the whole rig and everything about the beginning of this year, actually. So he's 19. He hasn't done anything before. So, but he seems to be, he's loving it, So you never know.
That would be awesome if he ever shows up with us, but obviously we will have to wait and see whether that actually happens or not.
Yeah, no, it'd be great. Why not? Definitely.
Well, for our viewers who are interested in learning more about Stefan's work, stefanjohansson.com. You also have a separate address for the artwork. I think it's stefanjohansson.art. Is that correct?
They go to the same source, actually. So either one works. Yeah.
Okay.
And he's on Instagram.
And I might as well mention, and also if any viewers are interested, if you click SJ20 then you'll get a 20% discount if you decide to buy anything.
Yeah. And on Instagram at Stefan Johansson Official, I believe, is you.
That's right.
Cool.
Correct, yeah.
All right. Well, Stefan,
Awesome.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate you, and hope you have a good rest of your week. And thank you to our viewers for watching. We'll be back with another podcast soon. Until then, for Jonatan, this is Jason White saying so long. We'll see you on our next podcast. Please take care and be safe.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. All right. All the best.
Yep.